Hey there, we are now going to analyze another anti-Sicilian variation, what we call anti-Sicilian. That is a line in which white avoids the open Sicilian and the main lines in the Sicilian defense. So here after e4 and c5, white plays the move c3. The main idea is that white wants to occupy the center and capture back with the pawn instead of the knight or the queen, and get 2 pawns on the center to gain a space advantage. And here we're going to cover many lines, but our main idea is going to be very similar. We want to counterattack on the center. One idea here is to play d5, but the other main line, which is the one that I suggest, is to go knight to f6. So we are already attacking the pawn e4, and here white will normally reply e5. First of all, playing d3 is an option, but in a way it's not very consistent because white played the move c3 to go d4. So here we could play pretty much anything. We could even play g6 and bishop to g7 and then castle. So d3 here is possible, but black gets a perfectly playable position. Defending the pawn with the queen wouldn't make a lot of sense because the queen would not support d4 anymore. Or another idea might be bishop to d3, but in this particular position, since we didn't play d6, we can take advantage of this and we could play d5 at the right moment. For example, after knight to c6 and knight to f3, here we can play d5, we counterattack on the center. This bishop on d3 doesn't make a lot of sense. So white's idea normally is to go bishop to c2 and d4, but here it's just a bit too slow because we can play d5 directly. And in this position, if white takes on d5, then we could even capture with the queen, taking advantage of this bishop on d3, which is not very well placed. Or if white plays e5, here we have many possible moves, but we could even counterattack with the move c4, and then just move the knight, for example after bishop to c2, then go knight to g4, and we just get a lot of counterplay, and black is doing perfectly fine. So these are just real lines, but in most cases white will play e5, and here we're gonna play the move knight to d5. It's quite important not to play knight to e4 because after d3 this knight is going to be trapped. But in any case, here we're going to play knight to d5, and here white's main idea is to go d4. If white plays something else, then we're going to continue in very similar fashion. For example, if white plays g3, then we're going to play d6. Our idea is to counterattack white's center. So white's main ideas here are to play either d4 or knight to f3 and then d4. The ideas are very similar. Bishop to c4 is an idea that we'll see later. White might play it straight away, but in all cases we're gonna play knight to b6, attacking the bishop, and after the bishop moves, here we even have additional options like playing c4 or d5, and if white plays d4 in this position, here we're gonna simply capture and then develop the bishop. In general, if we can develop the bishop on c8 and then go e6, we're gonna get a very decent position. That's why in this position white will normally capture, and then we just capture with the queen, and we're gonna get very similar positions that we'll analyze later. And here we even have the option of going c4. For example, after knight to f3, here we could even go c4, attacking the bishop, and we see that we're limiting white's pieces. That's why d4 makes a lot of sense. Here we're gonna capture on d4, and in this position white normally plays knight to f3 in order to keep some flexibility, since this pawn is going to be pinned. Now after knight to f3 we cannot capture on c3 because this knight would be hanging. So after taking on d4, knight to f3 is more commonly played than taking on d4. In any case, we're gonna get very similar position. We might easily transpose. And additionally, here white has tried the move queen takes d4, which is not that common. It looks a bit artificial to me because white plays c3 and then not capture with the pawn. And here we could simply play the move e6, first defend the knight, and then we just go knight to c6. For example, after knight to f3, play knight to c6, develop and attack the queen. And here white normally plays queen to e4. And here in this position we can continue attacking the queen with the move f5. If white captures on f6, then after knight takes, we get good development, we attack the queen. We also have these two central pawns that we can advance. Or after f5, queen to e2 has been tried, and in the model game black played a very nice move, played the move b5, preventing some c4 ideas, and planning to go a5 and bishop to a6, trying to attack the queen on e2. So white's position looks quite artificial to me. So this move b5 involves a pawn sacrifice. So after queen takes, black played queen to c7, attacking the pawn on e5, and after queen to e2 and a5, black gets a lot of initiative for the pawn, bishop to a6 is coming, and this pawn on e5 is actually quite weak. So this position might already be slightly better for black. So queen takes e4 is not that common, pawn takes e4 or even knight to f3 is the main move here, and in this position we're going to continue with knight to c6. So from our side our plan is going to be quite direct, just develop knight to c6 and then go d6, or knight to b6 if our knight on d5 is attacked. So here in this position the main line goes pawn takes e4, and we attack the center straight away. We have an idea to take on e5. And here in this position, in most games, white goes bishop to c4. If white plays knight to c3, then we can simply take on e5, just capture with the pawn. And after pawn takes, here if white takes with the knight, we get very similar positions, then we just capture on c3. And if white captures, then we just take on e5, and after pawn takes, we trade queens. These positions are objectively equal, but we may even try to get an advantage by attacking white's pawns. Or after pawn takes and pawn takes, we get very similar positions, we just trade on c3, and after queen takes, otherwise we would trade and bring the king to d1. Here we could even capture with the knight, and after pawn takes and bishop to d7, again the position is fairly balanced, but we may even try to fight for an advantage by attacking white's pawns. So bishop to c4 is a critical try for white. If white captures on d6, here we just capture with the queen and develop the queen, and we get a very good development. For example, after knight to c3, here we could develop with bishop to g4 and then go e6. So in general in these positions we want to develop the bishop on c8 and not get it behind our pawns. Here we're not in a rush to give the bishop for the knight. For example, after bishop to e2, we just play e6, and in this position white gets an isolated pawn on d4, which might be a target in the long run. It also has some pros because it controls the e5 square, so this is a position with chances for both sides. So after d6, bishop to c4 is played more often, and here we're going to move the knight, knight to b6, we attack the bishop, and here white has two main ways to proceed. One of them is to go bishop to b5, and here we're gonna simply capture on e5. If white captures with the pawn, again we trade queens and we have no problems. So knight takes e5 is much more logical. White even has threats over c6. That's why we're gonna play bishop to d7. And here white might capture on c6. And white might trade again. Now this bishop is quite strong here. And after knight takes and pawn takes, we get these positions on which white gets an isolated pawn on d4 and we get an isolated pawn on c6. And the position is actually quite balanced. For example, after white castles, in the model game black played this idea of g6 and then developing the bishop to g7 to get counterplay against the pawn on d4. So both sides have their weak pawns, but there's not a lot more going on in the position. And the other idea that white has tried in this position is knight takes e7. Knight to c3 has been played, but in general here after knight takes e5, we're going to trade a lot of pieces and get a balanced position. So the other main idea here is to take with the knight, and after queen takes, play knight to c3. Now d5 is a big threat, but here we would simply play e6. And after white castles, we also get a position which is fairly balanced because even though white has the two bishops, black has a slightly better pawn structure, and this pawn on d4 might become a target, so black is not having any big problems here. So after bishop to c4 and knight to b6, the other main alternative is bishop to b3, and in this position we're gonna capture on e5, and here white tries the move d5. Trading on e5, as we saw in many lines, is not a problem for us. That's why d5 is a more ambitious try, and here we're gonna play knight to a5, attacking the bishop, and then planning to take on d5. That's why white normally plays knight to c3. And in this position, black has many options. First of all, black is a pawn up so far, but in general in these lines we don't want to be too greedy because we still have to develop our pieces. But here in the model game, black played bishop to g4, pinning the knight. And after bishop to e3, black captured on b3, and after queen takes, bishop takes, and pawn takes. First of all, we see that white's pawn structure is not great. And here black played the move g6 in order to develop the bishop and castle short. So here black's main problem might be to castle, that's why g6 is a good move. And after a4, planning to go a5, black again decided to give more importance to development than material and played rook to c8. So after a5, knight to c4, just giving the pawn back, and after queen takes b7, black took on e3, and after pawn takes bishop to h6, attacking the pawn on e3 and now planning to castle. And we see that once black castles, white's king is actually not going to be very safe because white's pawns are a bit overstretched. And in fact, after queen to b5, which is not a very good move, black played a very strong king to f8, castling by hand. Now the king will come to g7, and black will get a lot of counterplay against white's position and manage to win the game. So after knight to c6, taking on d4 is a logical way to continue, taking with the pawn. But bishop to c4 in this particular position has also been tried before taking on d4. And here we're going to play knight to b6. And now the bishop will normally come to b3. Here bishop to b5 doesn't make a lot of sense because we didn't move the pawn on d7. So here we might even go a6. And if white captures, then after pawn takes, this bishop is going to develop very quickly. So this is great for us. That's why after knight to b6, bishop to e3 is played here. And here it is very important not to be greedy because we are still many moves away from castling and white's pieces are quite active. So we see that white can develop its pieces very quickly, but we can't. So here we don't want to take on c3 and help white develop just for a pawn. So here we could simply play the move d5, planning to develop the bishop. So here in this position, if white doesn't take en passant, then we're gonna get a lot of counterplay on white's center. So taking on d6 is more logical. The pawn on d5 was also restricting this bishop. So taking en passant is the main continuation here. And in this position again, we don't want to get too greedy and take on c3 to help white develop. And here white normally castles, still offers a pawn, but in any case, no matter whether white castles or whether white takes on d4, for example, here we're going to continue with the move bishop to e6. We want to trade this bishop on c8 for this active bishop on e3, so our main idea is to play bishop to e6. For example, if white takes on d4, then we simply play bishop to e6, planning to trade bishops. If white plays knight to a3, we also play bishop to e6. Or if white castles directly, which is the most common move in the position, here we're gonna play bishop to e6, offering this trade of bishops. And again here, white very often insists with this idea of giving the pawn, and very often plays the move knight to a3. And here we have many options, but a very simple and consistent way to continue here is to trade, because we wanted to trade bishops. And after queen takes, white might have ideas to play knight to b5, attacking the queen, and then playing something like bishop to f4. That's why, since we have to move the queen, queen to d5 is quite simple and good for us. And here even white has to be a bit careful. If white trades queens, then after knight takes, white gets the pawn back, but after we trade on d4, we could play something like e6, and we get these positions on which we could even try to play for an advantage by trying to attack this isolated pawn on d4. But in any case, in the model game, white played knight to b5, which is a much better try, planning to play knight to c7, forking pretty much all of our pieces. But after the simple rook to c8, white finally took on d4, and after knight takes and knight takes, e6, and then white just going to develop the bishop, and there's actually not a lot going on in this position, the position is just quite balanced. Great, so you now know how to play against the Alapin variation. After white plays c3, we're gonna play knight to f6, and here white will pretty much always continue with e5, and after knight to d5, here white will normally go d4 or knight to f3, which won't change the position a lot, because after d4 and pawn takes, here white might try knight to f3, and after knight to c6, our main idea is to counterattack the center with d6 straight away, if white captures on d4, or if white plays bishop to c4, which is another typical idea in the Alapin. After knight to b6 and bishop to b3, here we could play d6, or even d5 is also quite strong, because in practical terms white has to take on d6, because otherwise we're gonna get a very good position. And after pawn takes and queen takes, just keep this important idea in this position to play bishop to e6 in order to trade bishops and get a very comfortable position. So the Alapin is quite a solid option for white, so with correct play we're normally going to equalize. But on the other hand, these positions will normally offer less chances to win for either side.